Hey, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming out this morning. I'm Jessica Gwynn. I'm the Community Development Director. I was hoping that you all were going to bring all of your friends to this exciting Monday morning meeting about the Unified Development Code, but you kind of let me down. But I'm glad you guys are here, so thank you for being here. And seriously, this is actually our third public meeting that we've done for this portion of the Unified Development Code, and we are offering a total of 6 because we wanted to be sure we hit all parts of the county, and also offered some daytime and nighttime meetings, just recognizing that certain times of day may work better for other people. So with all that being said, I appreciate you all being here. We have with us several members of our zoning staff. So up here we've got John Peterson. Some of you guys may recognize his face. He's our zoning division manager. Of course, we've got Jeannie and Cameron. We've got Phil over here with our planning group. And of course, we have Tim with the water group. So appreciate them being here today to listen to the presentation and to help with any questions. So we actually have a consultant team, Clarion and Associates, who we brought on board, I guess about, I don't know, it's been a year or so ago. I can't, time is flying. Well, no, it's been about a year and a half ago. Brought them on to help us and to lead us in this effort to update our codes in the interest of keeping the budget for the project reasonable. The staff here is going to be leading some of the meetings to try and help cut down on some of those consultant costs and be sure that we focus those limited resources, those dollars, where we really need them versus having them attend 1,000 meetings. So with all that being said, I'll just give you a quick overview of the project and the things that we're working on here. I'll talk a little bit about the status of the background of the project to this point. We really kicked it off in earnest about a year ago. We had our kickoff meetings last December. We'll talk about potential project goals and then also next steps. But we also want to hear from you. So ultimately, and you may have heard this before, if you're here at this meeting this morning, hopefully you're not brand new to the Unified Development Code process and understanding what we're doing here, but there's a number of reasons that we're doing this. So currently in Cobb County, we have several documents that regulate development and zoning in the county. So of course, we have our zoning ordinance, was adopted about 50 years ago. That's one piece of it, a couple hundred pages of code, a lot of it very difficult to follow. That was adopted nearly 50 years ago. It hasn't been comprehensively a full update of that done since that time. It's been piecemealed. We do code amendments pretty much every year, but it's just sort of on a case-by-case, need-by-need basis to update the code as we need to. As a result, again, we have the zoning ordinance. We also had the development standards, development regulations, which is another document that's a few hundred pages. Then we have design guidelines for certain corridors of the county. And then, of course, there's stipulations that get attached to zoning. So ultimately, we have all of these documents that are guiding and regulating development in Cobb. Some of them have some inconsistencies. For instance, you might have one term that's defined one way in one place, and then the same term is defined differently in another place. So ultimately here, we're looking to bring all of these documents into a one-stop shop, the Unified Development Code. So one document that you go to for all regulations pertaining to development in Cobb right there, so that way we can eliminate those inconsistencies, that we can update it. And we'll talk about several of the areas that need updating. And also that way, hopefully it'll be easier for both you all as the public and as residents to understand and to have a good expectation of what might be happening in your neighborhood. That way it'll be easier for people who are doing work in Cobb and designing projects in Cobb to understand what those expectations are. And of course for our staff also as we're doing review to ensure that we're being consistent in reviewing those. And ultimately, through updating the UDC, of course, we have a comprehensive plan. The 2040 comprehensive plan was last updated. We did a partial update in 2022. The next full update of that will come in 2027. The comprehensive plan is essentially the policy for land use and planning in Cobb. The codes, or in this case, the Unified Development Code, are tools to help guide or help ensure that policy happens. So the policy, the comprehensive plan doesn't carry the weight of the law. The code does. So it's the legal teeth, the legal mechanism to implement the comprehensive plan. Just a quick overview of the project schedule. So this is not something that is done overnight. It's definitely a heavy lift. And so we're taking this in several phases. There's 5 main tasks. Initially last year in the fall, we kicked off with the project initiation and orientation. So kickoff meetings there. We have a couple of focus groups that are a part of the process. One of them is a focus group that the Board of Commissioners has appointed that includes representatives of many of our civic organizations. And then we have another focus group that is made up of the folks who are doing those designs and the development here so that they can have an understanding of the project, and also we can have an understanding of where in our process maybe some of the pinch points are for them right now. So we did the project orientation last year about this time, and then after that moved into preparing the code assessment document. So that's what we're going to be talking about this morning is the code assessment document. The code assessment is not the code. So basically what happened after the project initiation, the consultant team went back and they took all the feedback they heard from the initial focus groups and public meetings. They took all the input that they received from staff, because we all met with them also and told them some of the things that we run into on the staff level as we're doing reviews and what have you that may need to be addressed. They also did their own review of our documents. And based on that, they put together the code assessment document. And essentially, the code assessment document is sort of a diagnosis. It's here are the things that we heard. Here are some of the issues that we heard. Here are some ideas that we have on how we might want to address those. And then at this point, we take a step back and we have a check-in and say, okay, is what they're hearing right? Are we on the right track? Before we send our consultant team off to start drafting code that may not be quite what is right for Cobb. So that's the opportunity that we have now, is to provide that feedback to them about, are they on the right track? So after we get through these public meetings and provide that input back to the consultant team, then they'll begin really working on drafting the Unified Development Code. So that'll actually be the work product. That is actually going to be drafted in 3 installments, because that's a big elephant to eat all at once. We're going to do it in 3 installments. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but also with all those installments, we'll have more meetings, more opportunity for the public to weigh in, give feedback, and for those documents to be updated before the final draft is done. So the final draft we expect to be done, or not the final draft, but the full complete draft we expect to be done sometime in the summertime. And then basically after that, what they're going to do is take the draft document and pick a few sites in the county and say, okay, if we were to develop this site under the Unified Development Code, what would that look like? Or if it was going to be developed under the current code, what would it look like? And from there, we can look and see what those results are, make sure that it's achieving the desired results. We want to be sure that it's something that's going to work for us before we fully adopt it. And then we expect to have our final round of public meetings, revisions, and also adoption we expect to take place about this time next year. So hopefully you've had a chance, and if you haven't already, go check out the project website. It's cobbcountyudc.com. It's got all of the information about the project up there as you're looking, as there's new work products produced. Those will be published. For instance, we right now have the full code assessment document, which is about 145, 150 pages. That's up there for you to go take a look at. Read it. Mark it up, send us emails if you have any thoughts or comments about it. We'd love to hear those. There's also an opportunity for you to sign up for project updates. You'll see the schedule of upcoming meetings on there. There's an FAQ sheet and also a contact information. So if you have questions or want to send in your feedback, that's the place to do it. So I hope that you guys will check that out, share it with your friends and neighbors, and let them know, check it out also. It's a great tool for us as we move forward. So the purpose of the code assessment, and that's what we're here to talk about today. As I shared with you, they've done a comprehensive review of the current zoning ordinance and also the subdivision regulations. We've, through that process, identified some of the key planning and development goals, looking to see how the current regulations are helping us work towards those goals. There's changes in there, as I said, to help update some of those regulations that have been suggested that we can consider and look at implementing into the new UDC. And also, the code assessment document, several pages of that document is actually an outline of how they propose to lay out the new UDC so that you can see it. So UDC being Unified Development Code, you can see it and kind of see how it would be laid out. So whenever you look at the code assessment document, there's an introduction and an overview, and it tells you a little bit about the process that we've been through to this point. As I said, then, of course, there's a diagnosis, including the goals and the themes. You'll see that outline, and then there's an appendix, which also includes a great graphic that shows what we expect the new document to look like. So we're going to talk through several key themes. There are 5 of them, and I'm not going to read them off here because we're going to go over each one individually. So we'll start with theme number 1. And this was the number 1 goal. I mentioned that we have several documents and several hundred pages of regulations currently guiding development in Cobb. So number 1 goal, let's make this more user-friendly. Let's make it more user-friendly for you all. Let's make it more user-friendly for our team, as well as for the folks who are looking to these regulations to bring good development to Cobb. So some of the key recommendations was to make the structure a little bit more logical, a little bit more intuitive, to use graphics, illustrations, and tables. We always hear that a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And I think that's really what we're going to achieve here. Something to keep in mind when the code was initially adopted, it's all text, but there's so much more that we can do with computers, with graphics and everything that can really help tell the story and show people what development should look like versus just reading through lots and lots of words. Improving the document formatting, clear, concise language, and then, of course, streamlining, clarifying the review procedures. So all of those, I think, ultimately will help us to have a more easier to use and a more efficient document to help guide the process. One of the things that you'll see, the picture to the left here is sort of what our code currently looks like. So you see there's a lot of text. It's kind of small, with lots and lots of bullet points and sub-bullet points. So that's what it looks like now. This is another example of another community and what it looks like. All the same text that you see over here is basically condensed to this drawing here. So you'll see there's a drawing of exactly where on the lot does the house sit. Okay, where are the setbacks? What do those measurements look like? And that's what we're trying to work towards. So here you can see another example of what that would look like. So right now, you saw this text on the left for the R30 zoning district. It would be now laid out more like this, and this is not our R30 zoning district. This is just a picture for you to kind of get an idea. But you'll see here up at the top, first it's got the purpose section. What is the purpose of this particular zoning district? For example, R30 zoning district we know is intended for single-family residential uses, 30,000 square foot lots. Then it makes a reference to the use standards. Right now in our code, it spells out in each zoning district, here are all the uses that are allowed. Then we also have a use chart that says, here are all the uses that are allowed. If it gets changed in one place in the code amendment, there's usually a couple of other places it's also got to be changed out, and sometimes it gets missed. So this will help eliminate that, because rather than listing out all the uses that are allowed in R30, it's going to make reference to the use table where they can go look and say, okay, here are the things that we can do there. So just cross-referencing there, I think, is going to really help us to eliminate inconsistencies and issues down the road. And it gets into the table of density and dimensional standards. So that's where you're going to find things like your minimum lot area. You'll find your setbacks, front yard, side yard, rear yard setbacks, lot coverage, maximum height. All of those things will be listed in the density and dimensional standards. And then this drawing over here links directly to this. So not only does it show it, but it also shows you on the drawing, okay, where exactly are we measuring the side yard setback? Where exactly is the front yard? So those are the things that you'll be able to see here on the diagram, and that'll be very helpful. And then at the bottom, you'll see there's reference to other standards. So we know for each of our zoning districts, there's what's spelled out for that specific district, but there are other standards that are applicable. There may be landscaping standards, there may be parking standards, those sorts of things that'll be referenced here that you also need to look at these other sections, but it'll all be tied back to one spot. And that way it's going to help to, again, eliminate duplication, eliminate opportunity for inconsistencies down the road, and also help streamline the document and make it more user-friendly. I mentioned the, this speaks specifically to our review procedures. There's going to be a chart that really consolidates into one section. I'm sorry, Ron, did you have a question about the first piece?
Lists all the allowable uses in the zoning district. You got one line there, so is the new code going to continue to list the allowable uses? Are you showing one line there?
That's a great question, Ron. So the question was, and just so y'all know, you're being recorded today because we're actually going to film this version and post it online, so people who couldn't make it out to a meeting will be able to come. So I'm going to repeat your question back. On the document here, under use standards, you do see one line, and this one actually says, I can't read the first word, but use-specific standards for principal, accessory, and temporary uses are established in Part D use regulations. So it references another section. So right now in our current code, it's spelled out, okay, you can have A, B, C, D, E, F, G in this zoning district. And then there's also the use chart, the use chart where you can go look and it says, okay, let's say for instance, single family house. Here are all the districts that's permitted in. Well, what happens right now, if you change something, let's say you eliminate a use from one of the zoning districts, you have to take it out of that specific zoning district, and then you have to go back and make sure that you also update the use chart. So rather than having that in two places, it's going to reference the use chart for the uses, look at this chart, and that way it's all in one place. So the uses are still spelled out, they're just not going to be duplicated like they are currently. All right, so we're going to keep moving. Again, just wanting to be sure that it's clear what the process is for different review procedures. So all those procedures, the rules and procedures, are going to be in one section, one sort of administrative section that helps tell how we're going to administer the code and accept different applications and what have you, how those will be reviewed. So the procedures will be standardized. It's going to be clarified and expanded where you're going to need to have a site plan, what do the subdivision procedures look like, also offering compliance procedures. Another thing, I think perhaps the most noteworthy thing here that I wanted to point out is that currently our code does not authorize any sort of administrative adjustments. So sometimes what happens, a project will be approved, like let's again use a single family residence, single family neighborhood. It may be approved with, say, a 30-foot front yard setback. Houses, everything, the plans are drawn with 30-foot setbacks in the front yard. Well, there may be a lot where there's a topographical issue or something out there that you're not really aware of until you actually get out there and start moving dirt, that maybe it needs to be 29 feet for one lot. If we have this in an administrative adjustment, administrative variance, that's something that is in most codes, but it would be very narrowly used, so it would be very clearly spelled out in the document what standards there could be opportunity for administrative adjustments, how limited that could be, so it's very limited. And then also, in order to qualify that, what would the requirements be? So that's something that we can talk about. But ultimately, so if there is something minor that doesn't change the character of the neighborhood, and again, it's minor, we're talking like 6 inches or a foot, then that's something that could be done without having to go back through the full Board of Zoning Appeals process and holding someone up who's potentially trying to build a house or what have you. But also very limited, very specific reasons that those would be done. So moving on to theme 2 and 3, talking about housing zone districts and uses. One thing that we heard loud and clear as we started talking about this process is Cobb County values our existing single-family neighborhoods. We don't want to see changes to the existing single-family zoning districts. And I'll tell you, as a Cobb County resident, born and raised, I also love my house in a single-family neighborhood on a cul-de-sac in the suburbs of West Cobb. So there is no intention to change any of that. So, and I'll show you here in a minute, but all of the existing single-family districts stay exactly as they are. No changes to setbacks, no changes to density, no changes. The zoning districts will be reorganized a little bit to support different types of mixed-use development in appropriate places. The Battery is really cool. It's not appropriate everywhere, right? Because there's not the infrastructure, there's not the existing character to support that. So that's where we say we want to be sure that we've got the right uses in the right places. Adding new plan development districts, we'll talk about that in a little bit more. Also modernizing the format and use regulations, talking about different types of housing in appropriate places in the county. Again, single family districts don't change, but recognizing that people have different needs, especially as they work through different phases of life, maybe different lifestyle preferences. So we want to be sure that we're being thoughtful of what types of housing needs there may be, but also that those would be in the appropriate places. So, again, no changes to the single-family detached zone districts. So you can see here, and there's a chart in the code assessment that's very thorough, but you'll see it spells out all of the current zoning districts and then what the proposed district is. And what you don't see on here is there's another column, and this was for the sake of fitting it on the slide, that says no changes. So your R80, R40, RR, R30, R20, R15, R12, none of that changes. Ron, you have a question?
No changes to allowable uses.
No changes to anything.
But no changes to allowable uses specifically.
Right, there are no changes to allowable uses. There are no changes to the lot dimensions. These single-family districts stay exactly as is. Yes, great question. Residential duplex, no changes. Fee simple townhouse, that's one of the districts where there's some slight changes, and you can look at the code assessment for a little bit more detail, but really just looking at, again, we've got townhouse units, but also maybe some opportunity for some cottage units, those sorts of things. All the other districts, RA4, 5, 6, RM8, RM12, RM16, no changes. Those carry over just as they are right now in our code. Currently, the residential mid-rise and residential high-rise districts are not something that we're accepting applications for. What's been proposed, and again, this is proposed, these are all ideas, is to bring these back as the RM24 and RM60 residential districts, multifamily districts, again, with the intent being those would be in places where it's appropriate. So for the sake of our future land use map, and you can actually see on the code assessment on the website where you see the full document, it also tells what future land use categories each of these zoning districts would be appropriate in. The only place that these higher density multifamily districts would be appropriate in would be in the regional activity centers in the future land use map. So that's going to focus on the area around Cumberland and the area like immediately at Town Center, right there along the I-75 corridor. That's where the regional activity centers are in Cobb. That's where those higher density, higher intensity uses currently are. That's where that's proposed to continue. And what I want to be clear on here, first of all, no property is being rezoned. Nobody's zoning district is going to change. We're not changing any rezonings. There's no zoning happening as part of this process. In order for a property to be rezoned, it would come in just like it is now with an application, full public hearing process. That's how property gets rezoned. This is just the tool for implementing the zoning. The other thing that I want to be clear on, and where was I going with this? Okay, so is that this is not changing the future land use category for anything. Again, future land use map as part of our comprehensive plan, that's approved through that process. This is a tool for implementing the future land use plan, but it is not changing the future land use plan. So where the RAC is currently defined, that regional activity center in the future land use plan, is exactly where it stays until down the road, if there's a comprehensive plan update and we hear from the public and from the commissioners there's desire to change that through that public process. That's not a part of this process right now. Talking about housing, we all recognize that, there are some housing challenges right now. And I think a lot of times people think about housing issues, they think only about affordability. And a lot of times when people think about affordability, they're only thinking about housing for low-income families. But right now, whenever the median home sale in Cobb County is over $400,000, and the average median household income in Cobb County is about $95,000, $96,000, great income. But for a household making $95,000, $96,000 a year, a $400,000 house may be a little bit outside of what they'd be able to afford. So we need to be mindful of that. But this is not about addressing the housing issues. there are some things here, some tools here that we want to look at, because keeping in mind that housing is not just about affordability, but we also have to talk about housing choice and understanding that, again, as people age, as people are starting out, young professionals may seek and desire a different type of housing and different lifestyle than someone with a young family, someone with growing children. Someone, as your kids move out and you're empty nesters, maybe at that point you want something else entirely. As our physical abilities may change over the years, that may also dictate, hey, single-story living probably makes more sense for me at this point. Maybe I don't want to have the big yard to maintain anymore. So understanding that housing affordability is one aspect of it that's important, but also housing choice is important. And at this point, there are a lot of different housing options that are out there beyond maybe what was anticipated or contemplated when the current code was written. So it's not all about, is it a house or is it an apartment? There are fourplexes. Our code does allow for duplexes right now, but there are fourplexes. Mansion apartments, so it basically looks like a big house, but it may be split up into 6 apartments. That's multifamily housing, but it's not probably what a lot of you think about when you think about multifamily housing. It's not a big apartment complex. There are live-work units. That might be something. Cottage homes or cottage court homes, where you have smaller homes centered around a common green space rather than everybody has their half-acre or quarter-acre lot to maintain. We all have smaller houses. We maintain this green space together. We use it together. So again, just recognizing different lifestyles, different choices, but it should be in the right place. Yes, Phil?
Is there going to be anywhere in the revisions a requirement for affordable housing in mid-rise or high-rise apartment buildings?
And so the question was if there's going to be anything in the proposed amendments, the proposed document requiring affordability in the higher density zoning districts. Is that correct? Okay. That's not something that at this point has been put forward. I know that there's some interest at looking at what are some ways that we can encourage perhaps more affordability on some of those uses. I mean, it's really, again, it's not only about apartments. People may want to be able to own homes too. A lot of those are policy decisions that are in programs that would probably be outside of the scope of the Unified Development Code, but those are all things that we can certainly talk about as we move forward. Those typically, though, are going to be things that may be in some other programs, and I know there's discussion about what that might look like outside of the scope of this, but ultimately what we're trying to do here is ensure that there's opportunities in the code, that there's tools in place, that if we're going to have some other housing options, that we've got the right tools in place to be sure that those are developed thoughtfully and in the right place. Michael?
You described cottage homes. Does that include tiny homes in the umbrella?
Okay, so good question. So cottage homes, you asked if that includes tiny homes. Cottage homes typically are going to be under 1,000 square feet, so that could possibly be something that we could consider. And you also mentioned ADUs. ADUs, of course, being accessory dwelling units. At this point, Cobb County doesn't allow for accessory dwelling units. That's not something that would be covered by our current code. It's something that if there is appetite in the community, and that's something that we're hearing from you all, if it's something that we're hearing from the board and the policymakers, that's something that there's interest in pursuing, then certainly that's something that we can look at how do we implement that into the code. And a lot of counties and cities do have some allowance for accessory dwelling units. So, certainly we'd love to have some feedback on that. Thank you. So back to the zoning districts. So we've talked about housing a lot. Some of our current zoning districts, again, the LRC and the NRC, same, just very slight changes also likewise in the light industrial and heavy industrial uses. But as you'll see, most of our zoning districts as they currently stand will just roll right over into the new ordinance. One thing that we are also contemplating is the new mixed-use districts. Currently, we have the Urban Village Commercial District and the Planned Village Commercial District. You may be familiar with those. Changing those to be more of a true mixed-use district that would support a range of both residential and non-residential uses in identified activity centers. So your mixed-use AC neighborhood, MXN. That would really be more for some of those little activity centers that are like in your neighborhood. Like, for instance, I live in West Cobb. I think about where all the Due West come together. We've got sort of a little activity center that's growing up there. And then some more community type mixed use, so some larger uses that may be at some of the bigger intersections, some of those bigger nodes, versus MXR, the regional mixed use category, which would really be the highest density, highest intensity mixed use. So just like we do right now with the urban village commercial and the planned village commercial and then the regional retail commercial, scaling different scalability for mixed use development, ensuring that it's going to be mixed use development that's in line with the scale, the character, the intensity of the surrounding neighborhood, that it's a good fit. And with those mixed-use districts, again, we have the opportunities to incorporate in some more walkability. We would want to think about pedestrian infrastructure as well as vehicle infrastructure, and it may also allow for some additional types of housing and additional density, still appropriate to the area, but to support the additional retail uses and those businesses there. David, you have a question? Great.
Are there any accommodations made in the changes for conversion of uses to housing, such as there've been a couple of hotel to apartment conversions, some opportunities to convert offices to apartments or condos? Those are just things that have come across the docket in the past year or so. Is there any reference to any of the updates that relate to conversion of certain
Right.
uses?
That's a great question. And David Anderson, we appreciate him being here. He's our District 2 representative on the Planning Commission right now. So at this point, there's nothing that's been proposed to talk about that, and you're right. So, and for a little reference point of context for those of you who may not be aware, there are some hotels that have expressed interest in converting to be multifamily housing rather than hotel. We're going to convert this hotel to an apartment building. And we've seen several examples where shopping centers, for instance, my office is in an old grocery store shopping center. So we've seen several instances where some older buildings have been converted into some different uses. So we haven't had any discussions about that, but we can talk about that some and think about what might need to be included in the code. Because ultimately, if a building is a hotel today and they want to convert to apartments tomorrow, they're going to have to meet all the zoning requirements. They're going to have to be properly zoned, so they would need to go through the rezoning process. They're going to have to meet all the building code requirements. They're going to have to meet all the life safety requirements. So honestly, I don't know that there's a lot that would need to be changed here, because ultimately, whatever use it is going to have to fit the requirements of the proposed use. A couple of other things that we're looking at. So, go ahead, Ron. Yeah, absolutely.
David raises a great issue. If we've got existing hotels or existing shopping centers that have gone dark, or existing office buildings where a conversion to residential would solve problems as far as increasing the availability of residential, but it also solves the problem of that specific property to develop a new conversion district, allowing that sets its own regulations for the conversion of those properties without having to comply with, and give it a different zoning designation because it's a conversion, and set different standards. You may be able to facilitate those conversions and have it be a win-win-win situation. Win for the property owner, win for increasing the availability of housing, and potentially it's a win for the surrounding community because the property itself has become problematic.
Right.
So I would, David raises a great issue, and to develop a new conversion district may help facilitate.
Okay, and I'm going to paraphrase this for the sake of brevity, but what Ron is suggesting is that it may make some sense to have a conversion district that's focused on those conversions of perhaps office or hotel to housing is a tool to help turn around a potentially blighted property and to provide some other housing options. And I think, that is certainly something that we can explore if there may be some opportunities in the code. And I'm actually going to come to, there is a redevelopment corridor that's being proposed, so I'll come to that here in a minute. And that might be something that we can incorporate as part of that. We can talk through, maybe what that looks like and what opportunities are there. Because certainly if there are, recognizing that in Cobb, there's not a whole lot of opportunity for greenfield development at this point in the areas that it may be. There's not the infrastructure or the desire, the character to really support that. So really a lot of our best opportunity is in redevelopment. So we can certainly put that on the list and ask the consultants if they have any ideas or best practices that might be a good fit for us to explore here. All right, so moving right along. Plan development district. So you may recall that Cobb County used to have a plan development district, but that has been eliminated over the years. And there are still some areas that are still zoned PD, but they're essentially grandfathered. We're proposing to bring back the plan development district. And ultimately what that does is it provides, it's not a true mixed use, but it provides an opportunity to have some more innovative ideas about how a neighborhood is developed. For instance, I live in the Brookstone neighborhood. We have different types of housing. We've got single family houses, then we have another pocket where there's senior adult housing, and then we've got some office uses, and then we've got a grocery store, and we've got some other little shops that were all kind of developed together. And that's essentially what a planned development district would do, is it'd be give an opportunity for a larger tract of land to have a thoughtful process in how all of that is laid out to accommodate a variety of uses. It may allow for some other ideas about the setbacks or what have you. Again, that would be very specific to that area, that neighborhood. It would require a PD plan, so we talk about things that are site plan specific. Whenever you talk about a planned development district, that certainly needs to be site plan specific, so that way whatever is approved is what the public has had an opportunity to weigh in on through the public process, and something that the Board of Commissioners is accepting of, and from there would actually be a PD agreement that would be put in place with the county that clarifies very clearly, okay, this is what you're going to do. Here's the phasing, how it's going to be done. Here's all the things that we're going to agree to, and ultimately they're going to be held to that. So we've got two different plan development districts proposed, one being just PD, plan development, and another one being plan development, traditional neighborhood development, which is really going to be more of, you think about traditional neighborhoods where you've got the, they may be laid out with more blocks for the housing, there may be some small retail uses, and those sorts of things. Yes, David.
The previous slide had new proposed districts, mixed use,
Mm-hmm.
3 of them, and then planned development. Can you explain the difference between those two? How would they come forward? Is the mixed use going to have a section for, say, R15, R6, RA6, and, RM8?
When you're talking, that's a great question. How are,
Plan says, here's the whole plan.
right.
Mixed-use development's going to have an overarching plan that has to be.
Yeah, so that's a great question, David. I appreciate that. The question being, kind of what's the difference between the mixed-use districts and the planned development districts? The mixed-use districts are typically going to be a little bit, they may be more compact on a smaller property, probably with a little bit more density, a little bit more intensity, again, depending on where they're located in the county. Typically mixed use, we're talking about vertical mixed use, so maybe you've got some shops on the lower levels, maybe you've got some housing or office above. Whereas with the planned development district, it doesn't have, the mixed-use districts will have very specific, here are the setbacks, the height, all the things, that'll all be spelled out. Whereas the planned development district, again, it's not going to be as definitive what that would look like. It would be, this is how big the lot's got to be to consider this, and here, you've got to submit a site plan that shows. Typically with a planned development, you've got more sort of pockets, so maybe over here you've got a pocket of single family, then here you've got your pocket of townhomes, here you've got your little retail uses, maybe some senior housing. So it's really not so much vertical mixed use, but it would be very more site plan specific. And that's where it just sort of allows for a little bit more flexibility, but again, it's something that all have to be nailed down through that public hearing process.
Some
Right, they,
Mixed use is not taking current zoning categories and saying, well, this is going to be R15, and this is actually the property, and this is going to be.
exactly. Honestly, the PD district is probably a little bit more similar to that, saying, okay, here, this is sort of R20, and over here it's sort of, but yeah, so the mixed use is really going to be more vertical.
Approval process, both of those mixed use and land development district.
It's similar in that they'll still come through the full process and the plans and all the things. The plan development district, of course, will have that PD agreement because the plan development district itself in the code won't be as restrictive in terms of what you can have. So that's where, okay, we're allowing some room for creativity, flexibility, but the PD agreement then will spell that out. That PD agreement, that'll be approved as part of the public process. And the idea being, just allowing some opportunity for some innovative, creative thinking, some flexibility, and something that really may be a good fit for the neighborhood, depending on where it's at. Continuing with our zone districts, as you'll see here, the overlay districts that we have currently, the OSC, Open Space Community Overlay, well, right now we're only changing the naming here. So we've got the airport districts, the civilian airport hazard district, and the military airport hazard district. Those don't change. The only thing is, just for the sake of consistency, the wording is changed. So airport hazard civilian overlay and airport hazard military overlay. It doesn't change anything about the standards, so nothing changes. I know there was a lot of talk about Dobbins and what's in our code in terms of what land uses would be allowed in close proximity to Dobbins, and to understand that, Dobbins is an important part of our community and our local economy. None of this changes, so all those protections are still in place. And of course, we have the design overlay districts that are already in place. So right now, the Atlanta Road design overlay, Canton Road, Dallas Highway, Johnson Ferry, Macklin Road, and Vinings Village overlay. And I see we have an extra in Vinings here. We'll be sure that gets cleared up in the code. But all of those currently are design guidelines, but they are not codified. The Austell Road design overlay has been codified. When I say it's not codified, I mean it doesn't carry the weight of law. So something that we will discuss here, and it's already been done with Austell Road, also with the Mableton Parkway District, but that's all in the city of Mableton now. But something that we'll be discussing here, and the proposal is to bring these overlay districts actually into the code, so that way developers, builders are actually going to be, it'll give us more teeth to hold them to those standards that have been put together and agreed upon by the community over the years. Yes, David.
Near and dear to my heart, East Kyle. The Johnson Ferry Design Overlay District, I know of two in that area. One is basically Johnson Ferry Road south of Rodwell Road, and then the other is the Josh Community Plan. What is that?
Right, so this is the southern portion. So the Josh, and Phil Westbrook with our planning group is here, and I know he'll correct me if I'm off base because these were done before my time. But this is specific more to the southern portion of Johnson Ferry, whereas the Josh, that portion, there was the study that was done, but there were never actually design guidelines that were drafted as a result of that. So it was a planning effort. It's sort of like it was a mini comprehensive plan, but there were never any clear standards put into place specific to that area.
Will this recognize things like Josh or several of those that are guidelines and not codified?
Right, those guidelines, I'm sorry. Those guidelines are recognized in the comprehensive plan and are recognized as guidelines. They would not be codified as part of regulation.
For the Johnson Ferry.
Now, if the southern portion that we're talking here, this is being proposed to be codified, but that's for the southern portion. For the Josh portion, there would be nothing. That would still remain in the comprehensive plan, but not part of this new proposed UDC.
Yeah, and there's one or two more like that in the county that are, this is my guideline for this area. And the
Correct.
Johnson Ferry lower district was guidelines, and now you're proposing to incorporate that into.
The overlay design guidelines overlay are being proposed to be in this UDC. But the Josh project, there was no design guidelines associated with that project. That help? Thank you.
All right, thank you, Phil. Appreciate you being here. And we also have our resident design guidelines expert, Sharon Chen, over here. She's our urban design planner who does a great job of staying on top and sort of the expert on all things design guidelines and overlays. Yeah, absolutely, Ron.
So I didn't think about this before. It's not my area, so just out of curiosity, but isn't there a pit of Powers Ferry master plan?
Right. So as Phil was, and the question was for those of you who may, I'm sure there are a lot of people tuning in on TV that'll watch this later on. But the question was, isn't there a Powers Ferry master plan? And it's similar to Josh. There are several master plans throughout the county. Not all of those have design guidelines tied to them. Right. So one of the things that we've talked about, aside from this process, is a lot of those master plans were done several years ago. So internally, because, you know, we've got our staff. So internally with Phil's group, with the planning group, taking a look at some of those and seeing which ones may be due for an update, a refresh. And so if we do that, of course, we'll take that back out through the full public process. And down the road may determine that it might be appropriate to have some design guidelines or something codified. But at this point, those are just master plans and not guidelines. Great question, thank you. So as you all know, you may know, we have several districts in the county that are spelled out in the zoning ordinance that are no longer used anymore. So you can't, for instance, apply for a new application in the redevelopment overlay district. We don't accept applications for conservation subdivisions. All of these are retired districts and that we don't accept applications for them anymore, but there are still properties that hold that zoning. So we're incorporating as an appendix into the new UDC a retired districts category. And so that'll just list all of these retired districts and the standards that go with those. So that as those properties continue to exist in their current zoning district, that we'll know what standards need to be applied there. So it's just really there for reference until ultimately those will be phased out through, you know, rezoning requests and what have you down the road. So. Again, we talked about this already, but modernizing the district format. So we've already sort of looked at this, but this is just another graphic kind of showing what those zoning districts might look like in the code, how it'll be easier for you to go look at them and know, okay, where is the front yard setback exactly, and where is the side yard setback, and what if it's a corner lot? Then it gets a little weird. So just having something that's going to be a very visual, easy to follow format for each of our zoning districts. And same thing, we also talked about the use chart a little bit. Same thing, use chart, just like we have the use chart currently in our code, that'll carry over, but it's going to be laid out. We're going to be sure that there's clear definitions of what the uses are. If there are any use-specific standards, that those would be spelled out, and also to have a consolidated one-stop use table, so that way we won't have inconsistencies because we spell out what are the R20 uses in 3 different spots. Theme 4, moving on, is talking about development standards and modernizing development standards. So a great example I like to use, remember years ago on Friday at lunchtime, you would go to the bank to deposit your paycheck and you would sit in the line in the bank drive-thru for a very long time. So we don't do that anymore, right? You know, most of us probably have our paychecks direct deposited, or if somebody hands you a check, you probably pull out your mobile app on your phone, take a picture of it, bam, it's right there in your account. If you go to the bank, you'll see the drive-thrus are closed. They're not even open anymore. But our code still requires stacking for, I believe it's like 5 cars in each bank drive-through lane. We don't need that anymore, right? We think about how we do business differently. Especially after the pandemic, we all got accustomed to shopping online, and I think we all found that it's so easy to just go order things on Amazon, and the next day, if you've got Amazon Prime, it's here. Even on Black Friday, you go out Black Friday shopping, you used to hear the reports on the radio about Town Center Mall's parking lot is 95% full. People aren't shopping and doing business that way anymore. So we don't need quite the same level of parking that perhaps we needed before. So being mindful of that, I think if you drive around the county and you pass shopping centers, you're going to see seas of empty parking lots. And it's not that the businesses aren't doing well, because, you know, I go shop on AnnTaylor.com all the time. But maybe we're not so inclined to actually drive to the store and do our business that way. So some of the things that we're going to be talking about specifically is looking at mobility, circulation, and connectivity, so that in those developments, so that there's going to be clear, easy circulation throughout the development for both pedestrians and vehicles. Off-street parking and loading standards, again, that's something that's really going to be important for us to look at. Some uses require more parking. For instance, if you see a shopping center, especially a small shopping center that has like 3 restaurants in it, good luck finding a parking spot at lunchtime, right? But then we have other shopping centers where perhaps they're overparked at this point. Looking at electric vehicle parking, we actually had a code amendment with our last package of code amendments. We're having all these electric vehicle charging stations popping up in the county. Well, we just adopted a code because we don't need to have dozens of them 12 feet tall and lit up in neon. So the Board of Commissioners just adopted a code amendment that will help us rein that in, make sure that we've got opportunity for electric vehicle charging stations, but also that they're going to be a good fit, that they're going to be attractive, that they're not going to be obtrusive to the surrounding neighborhood. So thinking about those things, looking for opportunities for shared parking and parking reductions where we have a mixed use or a planned development district. You'll probably have more people walking. You may not need quite so much parking. And also establishing new standards for off-street loading. So ensuring that those loading areas are going to be where they're not so visible from the streets. Also that the circulation, they're not going to cause problems for parking and for pedestrian circulation on the site. Another thing that we're looking at as we talk about modernizing development standards is landscaping, specifically buffers and trees. So right now, our code says, hey, you've got to have a buffer. Well, what exactly does that mean? So we're looking at with the new UDC strengthening the tree protection standards and is incentivizing retaining existing trees. Also looking at our buffer and our parking lot landscaping standards, having some more clear expectations there about what that looks like. And then also establishing some street tree standards to have nice streetscapes. So as we talk about parking lots and circulation, all those things, a lot of it also is tied to landscaping. And I think as we see that maybe we don't need so many spaces, we may have some more opportunity to incorporate a little bit more green space on some properties into the future. Speaking of green space, talking about open space set-asides, looking at, are there some opportunities or are there some types of development that perhaps we should have a requirement for open space, whether it's public open space or private open space. Obviously, with your subdivisions, those are going to be private open space. But what does that look like? Is it usable open space or is it just an area that's not buildable? So thinking through that and what does that look like? Exterior lighting. And we actually just, I think 2 code amendment cycles ago, adopted some lighting standards for gas stations because a lot of the gas stations were putting these huge LED lights on the canopy and it's like spilling over into the road and creating a whole situation. Well, let's talk about lighting standards throughout the county. So that way, you don't have lighting from neighboring properties spilling onto your property and affecting your quiet enjoyment of your property. So that's something else that we're going to be talking about is how do we reduce glare and reduce light pollution, but also ensure that we're providing adequate lighting, especially in a lot of our public spaces and our commercial spaces and our office buildings and our apartment complexes, that there's going to be adequate lighting for security too. So being mindful of those. Talking about neighborhood compatibility standards, and I said at the beginning of the meeting that the number one thing that we heard as we were talking about the UDC and starting the process is we have to protect our single-family neighborhoods, and the neighborhoods being, one of the things that makes Cobb great for sure. So looking at neighborhood compatibility standards and ensuring that as there are commercial or office or what have you, as there are other developments in areas that abut commercial or individual single-family neighborhoods, that we've got some things in place so that way you don't have a giant building casting a shadow over your single-family house. So some of those things may look like limiting the building height within 150 feet of single-family residences. It may look like requiring parking spaces to be oriented away from the single-family neighborhood, so that way you don't have headlights glaring into your front yard or your backyard or wherever. Looking at different areas of the site, and we actually talked about this some whenever we were talking about our electric vehicle charges. Let's be sure that things like electric vehicle charging stations and dumpsters and drive-throughs and all of those things, if it's on a property that is next door to residential, that we're putting those pieces of, that you've got to have a dumpster, but let's be sure that we're not putting it right up against the residential property line. So that way you don't hear the garbage truck backing up and beeping and clanging the dumpster in the morning. So thinking through those things, like what are the things that we can do as we know that Cobb County is going to continue to grow, and as we know that, there's going to be redevelopment, what are the things that we can do to protect the integrity of our single-family neighborhoods? Revitalizing old commercial corridors, again, that's where a lot of our opportunity lies. That's where a lot of our challenges lie. And of course, Commissioner Burrow is here now. Good morning, Commissioner. One of the great examples, I think, of an old commercial corridor in need of some love is right there, the Sprayberry Crossing area, there at Sandy Plains and East Piedmont. And so seeing that property, that was a blighted property for years and years and years, old shopping center that, in its heyday, whenever it was still a shopping center, was a valuable resource to the community, has turned into a blight with disinvestment. And now then, that property is being redeveloped. I think that's something that we're all excited about, and what that could mean for other properties to continue redeveloping along those corridors. But thinking about our commercial corridors and looking at some ways that we can put some standards in place for the redeveloping commercial corridors that would help improve them, including streetscaping and street frontage standards, looking at perhaps some design standards to improve the look of the buildings, landscaping, updating the off-street parking requirements, and also allowing for a variety of housing types. Let's think about these things as opportunities to help those areas redevelop. So that's one of the other things that we're talking about. So with all of that, there's one other thing, and I want to back way up. I'm not going to go back to the slide, but one thing that I forgot to mention to you that I think is important as residents that I want you to know. One thing that a lot of communities have that we don't currently have in Cobb is an extra step in the zoning process that requires a community meeting before a zoning request gets to the Planning Commission meeting. In some areas, this is sort of happening organically, like, for instance, in the Bells Ferry area, in the East Cobb areas. We have some, Mableton's another great area where they've got some civic groups. There are a lot of areas that have some civic groups that do a good job of getting out there in front of zoning requests and meeting with the developers. But there's not something in our code that requires that. So one of the things that is being proposed that a lot of other communities use is to have a community meeting requirement prior to a zoning request getting to the Board of Commissioners or even to the Planning Commission. So if someone submits a zoning application and we'll look at what uses maybe require this. Maybe it's not every use. That's something we can talk about as part of this process and be sure we get it right. But as a request comes forward for zoning, they bring their application to our office. That the applicant would be responsible for hosting a community meeting. We would spell out in there who all they need to invite and how they invite the community, what's the radius, that they would hold a community meeting to have an opportunity to share with community before it gets to the Planning Commission what they're proposing, to hear input from the community, and to start that dialogue before it ever gets to the Planning Commission. Because what we're seeing a lot of times, there are some developers that do that, some applicants that do that and do a good job of it. There are some civic groups and some neighborhoods that are very active and insistent on it, but we don't have that throughout the county, so it's sort of a hodgepodge. A lot of times stuff gets to the Planning Commission meeting, and the residents say, I don't know anything about this. I know nothing about this request. And a lot of times they'll come up here in opposition and they say, I don't know if I'm opposed to it, but I just have some questions. So trying to get out in front of that before it gets to the Planning Commission to give the residents an opportunity to ask questions, share their concerns, share their feedback, so that hopefully by the time it gets to the Planning Commission, a lot of those issues maybe could have been worked out. That way we can have a better plan put forward before the Planning Commission. Maybe it won't get held up at the Planning Commission for a year, so that you all are going to have to keep coming to meetings for a year every month to hopefully try and get it right. So that's one of the things that we're incorporating into the process or we're proposing to incorporate into the process is that first step community meeting to give an opportunity for the applicant and the citizens in the area to sit down and talk about it. So hopefully that'll be a good thing. Yes, David.
One other thing I might recommend adding is for some of the districts where there are some site plan specific considerations, either a requirement or language around stipulation letters. It's something that it's a default action by a lot of applicants, particularly for larger projects, but if there's ones where there's a lot of detail that's kind of specific to that application, that too would be helpful to kind of codify. I don't know if that's maybe overkill, but it's something that's ultimately we end up asking for it in a lot of contexts where there needs to be a bit more
Right.
specificity. If there are areas that are not explicitly addressed as part of the zoning category.
Right. And so again, I'll paraphrase that for the sake of our hopeful viewers. Typically, if a rezoning request comes forward, especially depending on what type of request it is, it's not uncommon that a stipulation letter would be submitted by the applicant to the Board of Commissioners that say, here are all the things that we agree to that we'll do over and beyond what the code requires if this zoning is approved. And it may be that they're going to have some additional open space, or it may be that they're going to do 5-foot sidewalks instead of 4-foot sidewalks. All those things that then would be adopted and accepted by the Board of Commissioners and incorporated as a part of that zoning request. So ultimately, at that point, it becomes the law of that property. It becomes the code for that property. One of the goals of this process, if you look at the stipulation letters, and a lot of times, you may have 5 or 6 pages of stipulations. We've provided a lot of those letters to the consultants. A lot of times you see the same stipulations applied over and over again. So it's like, well, if that's something you're going to require every time, rather than putting it in a stipulation letter every time, let's put it in the code. If we want to have wider sidewalks, put it in the code. So hopefully that way it'll help to, if there are those things that are frequently coming up. Now, there's always going to be things that are unique to a property. Each property has unique circumstances in terms of topography, in terms of the neighborhood that surrounds it, in terms of the desires of the community there. So I don't think the stipulation letters ever go away entirely, but I think those stipulation letters will continue to serve as sort of an agreement between the applicant and the Board of Commissioners, and the Board of Commissioners on behalf of perhaps the community for how that site will develop. But hopefully we'll be able to incorporate a lot of those things into the code at this time as we move forward with the UDC. So just really quickly, I want to kind of explain to you how the Unified Development Code will be laid out. And you'll see this in the code assessment, but just kind of hitting the highlights of it. We wanted to ensure that it's a consistent structure that is organized in a way that makes sense, that it flows well. Right now, what happens a lot of times is staff, and again, I'm not in the zoning code as nearly as often as John and Jeannie and Cameron, but where is that again? A great example, you may be familiar with the single-family residential definitions. What is the definition of single-family residence and what that means? Well, that's in the definition where it says no more than 2 unrelated. Who would know to go look at the definition of single-family residence to find that it should be no more than 2 unrelated? Or how many people could park there? How many vehicles could be parked there? So we want to have this laid out in a way that makes sense so that you'll know where to go find things. So first of all, we'll have the general provisions. That's just all the legalese that basically gives the county the authority to regulate zoning and all those things. It gets into administration, which will cover things like your permitting, your review processes, your zoning processes. It gets into the zone districts. Okay, we're going to spell out all of the zoning districts. Here they are with their standards. The use regulations. So for each use, if there are regulations specific to those uses, those would be there. Then it gets into the development standards. Right now, that's a separate document, putting the development standards, which really pertains more to how the site itself is developed. Put it right here in the UDC, so you know where to find it. Subdivision standards. If a property is subdivided, how is that done? How is that recorded in perpetuity through the final plat? Nonconformities. There's going to be nonconformities. We have nonconformities out there. How are those handled? How long does that nonconformity, or grandfather status, a lot of people call it, how long is that applicable? At what point, what triggers that no longer being applicable? What does that look like? So that'll be at Article 7. Article 8 will be enforcement, and of course, the zoning and land development regulations are enforced primarily by the Code Enforcement Division. It's just going to carry over the way it is now, but that's where it's going to live. It's, we're not going to change all the enforcement procedures, but we're going to have it all in one place so you know where to find it. And then Article 9, very important, definitions and rules of construction, interpretation, and measurement. So right now, there's definitions scattered all over the code. Let's have one place where you find all of your definitions. Right here, Article 9. We talk about rules of interpretation and measurement. How are we interpreting it? A lot of times I think you have to, there's what do we think the code was supposed to say and what does the code actually say? So let's be clear, we're enforcing what the code actually says. And measurement. Okay, well, whenever we're talking about building height, are we measuring that from finished grade? Where exactly are we measuring that from? Where we're measuring the front yard setback, where exactly does that start and where does it stop? So putting in here into Article 9 so it's very clear, when we're measuring things, what are we measuring and from where? And then, of course, the appendix being those retired districts that we talked about. Still there for us to reference, but we're no longer accepting applications. Yes, Ron?
Jessica, if I could just go back for a second to the issue about the stipulations. And you mentioned sometimes there are stipulations that are very common and they do occur over and over and over. One that has to occur 100% of the time is minor modifications. And so not by regulation, but by policy here now, the exceptions to minor modifications, that these exceptions can't be done under minor modifications. But maybe the UDC is the perfect opportunity to, instead of having the same stipulation and exceptions over and over and over on 100% of zoning cases, codify it. So,
Yeah. Yes, that's a great question, Ron, and absolutely. The question was about minor modifications, and the stipulation letters typically speak to that and what can and can't be, subject to a minor modification. There needs to be some consistency there, and that's something that we would cover in the administration section. What minor modifications would be allowable, what constitutes minor modification, and what is not a minor modification, so that way it can be consistent throughout the county, clearly spelled out here in the UDC.
that could be one of the best things you're doing. If you're including that, that's spectacular.
Yeah, and again, that's something that is pretty typical in most modern codes, that there are some standards for what could be modified, and just a minor modification, and then what needs to go back through the public process. And so that's something that, so we need to be sure is included here. Bill?
Is signage going to be included somewhere in this, or is it?
So currently, the sign ordinance does live in the zoning ordinance. So I would expect that we would include this here. We'll have to figure out exactly which article it's going to go into. But yes, I would intend that the sign ordinance, we're not looking at any changes to the sign ordinance. We've pretty recently comprehensively updated that. So it'll just be a matter of where that lives. David?
Yeah, I don't know if the same question down, but the UDC is going to look at a number of other separate codes and standards and incorporate those. But understand the big picture. What are those? And are some of them going to remain and some of them going to come in here? Just like now we've got the zoning stuff and you also have the design standards. And they're separate documents.
Right.
You also have fire codes. There's some things in the fire codes that affect development. So what documents is the base for the review of, and have you determined which documents are going to be fully incorporated and go away?
That's also a great question, David. I appreciate that. And something actually we had a lot of discussion about last week whenever we had our consultants here. The zoning ordinance, the design standards, and the development standards, we anticipate those going into the Unified Development Code. Now, there are some things in the design or in the development standards today that are very specific to fire safety. Excuse me. We've had some conversation. We're going to continue having some conversation. I talked with with the fire marshal's office the other day a little bit about, is there some of this stuff that makes sense that it should stay with the UDC, or would it make more sense for some of this to move to the fire chapter? We're going to have similar conversations as we talk about like stormwater management and erosion control. Right now, all of that's in Chapter 50 of the code, and the consultant has all of these codes. They've got them all. But again, having some conversations about, okay, does it make sense that this would roll into the Unified Development Code, or should this stay in Chapter 50? So we're going to be having some of those conversations, even things like historic preservation. I think that'll probably continue to live in its own code. So that's a great question, but yes, that's something we're looking at.
You're talking about moving some too far. I was thinking there's always prohibitions and using things we need to involve in residential zoning reviews. That you have to go read through all this and then, is this being required? You got to jump all the way over to the fire code.
Right.
And sometimes you find it doesn't. It has to do with parking. How many cars can be on the street? Can they be on the street? What determination of a dead-end street has to be like? It's all in development, and a lot of that's in the fire code.
Right, and that's a great point. There's a lot of stuff in the fire code. So, and it may mean that there's stuff in the fire code that we say needs to move to the UDC, or there's stuff that's in the development standards that moves to the fire code. Ultimately, the goal being that there's less of that back and forth, or if there is going to be some back and forth, if we can't, if there is some need for separation still, that there are clear cross-references for, okay, so these are the standards, but you also want to be sure that you understand this and reference those sections, and then they can be tied together, hyperlinked on the Municode.
Right, and the consultant has all the instances and the purview to look at, right?
Yes, we've sent them. They've got all those codes, and of course, they also have the access to Municode. I want you to, we have a technical committee that's made up of all of the reviewing agencies and departments. So the fire marshal's office is at the table, the water system's at the table, stormwater, DOT. All of us are at the table together talking through this to try and ensure that we get that right. But those standards, again, they won't really be changing. It's just going to be a matter of kind of discussing where does it make the most sense for them to live in the county code. Ron?
Just looking up here, Article 9 is, to me, a little bit of a jumble. But interpretation and measurement, I can see those being in the same article. But I wonder if it would be better to break that into 3 throughs, have an article for definitions, an article for rules of construction, and an article for interpretation and measurement.
All right, so the question that Ron raised was whether it may make some sense to break Article 9 up into 3 sections, one being definitions, then rules of construction, and then interpretation and measurement. That's something that we can look at and see if it makes some sense. Absolutely.
You're trying to make everything more user-friendly. I think that would make it more user-friendly.
Exactly. Well, that's a great suggestion, and we can explore that further. Because yes, number one goal here is let's make this user friendly. Let's again, our code has been in place for 50 years, so we have to understand that what we do right now, this is likely going to be with us for decades, probably long beyond my time as community development director, maybe beyond my time in working years. So we want to do everything that we can, knowing that we can go back and make amendments as we need to, and that's going to happen. We'll have those, but we want to be sure that we produce a great document this time, because it's going to be an important thing for Cobb County for years. Y'all forgive my coughing. I was under the weather last week and still hanging on to a little bit of a cough, but so thank you for bearing with me. So that's the overview. We still have some more public meetings. We have, of course, this one today. We had 2 identical public meetings. We had one at Windy Hill Community Center last week, also one at the North Cobb Regional Library. We have this one this morning. Tomorrow morning, we have the same meeting. We're going to do it at the West Cobb Senior Center. Then we have another one tomorrow evening at the Thompson Community Center down in South Cobb. And then we have our final public meeting on Thursday night at the Mountain View Community Center. So just trying to get out to different parts of the county, hopefully provide people with an opportunity. Of course, they can also, once this video is done, they'll be able to go watch it online if they'd like to do that and do it from the comfort of their own home, perhaps with some popcorn. They can do that if they'd like. But just really trying to provide opportunity for people to be informed on the project. I just hope that you'll share with your neighbors. So with all of that, I just want to, if there are any additional comments or questions, we'd love to hear those. And you can always email us also. Ron, we'll start with you. It's cool to see so many familiar faces today.
So know that this is correct, I've heard this, that under the UDC, R12 and RA4 will be allowed in low-density residential, and if that's true, it seems like that's a backdoor way of allowing up to 4 units per acre in LDR, when LDR is supposed to be limited to 2.
Okay, and that's a great question, Ron. So in the code assessment right now, you'll see it does, as I mentioned before, it kind of ties the zoning districts to here, the future land use categories that could be in. So the question was RA4 and what's the other one? R12, that those would be allowed in the low-density districts or low-density land use areas. The code itself is not going to include those tie-ins, so that's not something that's going to be codified. It's really just there to kind of give people an idea, but we can take a look at that and we can adjust that in the code assessment if we need to make sure, because we're not changing anything in terms of what density is going to be allowable in any of the future land use districts. We're not changing the density that's allowable in any of the zone districts. So none of that's changing, so we can go back and double check and make sure that it's consistent what the code assessment says and the density versus what's spelled out in the comp plan.
Nobody's going to use RA4 unless they want more than 2.5 units per acre. Because there are other zoning districts available.
Right, right. But again, as far as just consistency with the comprehensive plan, we can check that out. But you're right, yeah, our RA4 is not, it's not really one of our more heavily utilized districts, is it, Don? But it's still there as an option.
Understood. But it would become a lot more utilized, or at least a lot more applied for, if it were a backdoor way of
Right.
getting 4 units per acre into LDR without it being in conflict with the land use plan.
Right.
Developers might jump all over it.
Right. So again, we're not going to include any reference to those future land, because future land uses, we update the comp plan really annually, and then we do a sort of halfway update every 5 years, and then we do a full update every 10 years, and hopefully we're not rewriting the zoning code that often. It's not the intention. But so with that being said, though, we're not going to include those references to the LDR and what have you. That's not actually going to be in the UDC. But we can make sure that what's in the chart and the code assessment, just so that everybody's clear, that it reflects the densities that are spelled out in the comprehensive plan, because that hasn't changed. What's spelled out in the comprehensive plan hasn't changed, and what densities are allowable in the zone districts hasn't changed. So we'll be sure that we go back and double check that and make sure that it's correct, because we want to ensure that people understand what types of density are appropriate and what types of zoning districts are appropriate where. Thank you. Yes. Okay, so the question was about nonconformities, and if the developer comes in and is supposed to, for instance, build OS, and they end up doing warehouses, if we have any recourse. So whenever we talk about nonconformities, we're talking about legal nonconformities. So something that was built under an old code and it was allowable, but under the current code it's not. Just because it's not allowable under the current code doesn't mean we go back and take that right away from them. They can continue having whatever it is they've built, but if it was allowable under the previous code when it was built, but if that use goes away, it changes. At that point, they would have to come into compliance with the current code. And John, you may have more context on specifically if there's a specific example, but ultimately, if a property is zoned and there's stipulations, it comes through the plan review process, and what they submit to us and what gets approved is supposed to be in line with the zoning ordinance and with any stipulations that apply to that property.
What is it? Like, we have a case right now, we've got Scanel, it was supposed to be Amazon warehouse, which wasn't allowable use, but the county said it was. They pulled out, the FedEx was supposed to come in, they pulled out. Now Scanel is building 2 massive industrial warehouses, and it says they're advertised as industrial warehouses, which is not a permitted use.
Okay. And you're absolutely correct, Tulin. Industrial warehouses are not permitted in the OS zoning district. Those two buildings on the Scannell property were permitted as wholesale and distribution facilities, which are permitted use. So this is not a case where it's a non-conforming use, it's a conforming use.
But they're advertising them as industrial warehouses, and they're having 80 loading docks each. It's clearly industrial warehouses that they're building. They're not building OS.
Yeah, they were permitted to build OS, Tulin. I understand what you're saying. And as far as the number of loading docks goes, there's nothing in the OS zoning code that prohibits the number of loading docks in the OS district. But, you know, if there is a problem in the future, we can have code enforcement go out there and take a look at it. But they're under a current permit for wholesale and distribution facility for those two buildings.
Which is not what they're building. So is there, in the new UDC code, is there something stating the amount of loading docks?
Well, as far as the new UDC, you know, I've asked the consultant a couple of times to put the OS district in the retired districts, because I do understand your concern with OS. It's very close to being light industrial, and you know, in my opinion, some of the uses in OS are more intense than industrial type uses. So we've asked the consultant to put OS into the retired districts for the future.
Thanks, John. Anything else? All right, well, the conversation doesn't stop here. Again, this is a process that's going to be ongoing for the next year. There'll be several opportunities for you to come to additional meetings, but also the inbox is always open. So if you think of something, a question that you meant to ask and you didn't, or you know, always you think of something inevitably whenever you pull out of the square. That's when I always have my best ideas and questions. Please don't hesitate to reach out. The contact information is on the project website. Check out the project website. Share it with your friends and neighbors. Your civic organizations, those groups, you know, we want to be sure that we're engaging you all as citizens, and just really appreciate the time that you took to come out here and be a part of our meeting today, understanding that this is an important initiative for Cobb County as we move forward. So thank you. Appreciate you guys being here and look forward to seeing you at future meetings. Have a fantastic week.